Hello, my friend. The old wizard wandered through Middle-earth for many years, gathering stories and legends so that none would be lost to the passage of time. And today, I shall share one of them with you. The sky above Valinor was a tapestry of endless gold and silver, where the light of two mighty trees spilled over the land like a dream that never faded. Tirion, the elder of the two trees, shimmered with argent light, its silver boughs casting shadows cool and deep. Laurelin, its golden twin, bathed the hills and valleys in a radiance warm and soft, like the breath of summer's first dawn. Under their luminous embrace, the blessed realm stood untouched by sorrow, a land where song and laughter wove through the air like threads of an eternal melody. And there in the white city of Tirion, beneath the gleaming spires and marbled halls, lived Eärendilion, a young lawmaster of the Noldor. He was not yet counted among the great scholars of his people, but his heart burned with the hunger for knowledge, for the whisper of secrets hidden in the dust of ancient scrolls. He spent his days within the great library of Tirion, poring over the records of the past, where tales of the Valar and the making of the world lay in gilded tomes, their letters inscribed in elvish runes finer than the stroke of a feather. He would have been content, perhaps, to remain forever within those hallowed halls, surrounded by the quiet murmurs of history, if not for the dreams. They came to him as shadows upon silver glass, visions that stirred his heart with unease. In them he saw the trees begin to wither, their light darkening, the golden leaves of Laurelin curling inward like hands closing upon an unseen sorrow. He heard voices in the wind, whispering of a nameless doom, of treachery sown in the roots of paradise itself. One evening, as he lingered over a manuscript older than the hills of Valinor, a presence stirred the quiet air behind him. He turned to find a figure wrapped in robes as white as sea foam, her eyes shining with the wisdom of ages. It was Istani, the keeper of law, whose voice was soft as the hush of dawn over the waters. "You have been reading long, Eärendilion," she said, her voice a gentle chime in the silence of the library. "And yet you seem troubled." He hesitated before answering, unsure if his fears were foolish. "I have been reading the old prophecies, Lady Istani," he confessed, his fingers resting upon the open pages before him. "And I dream of them, though I do not understand their meaning." She stepped closer, her gaze falling upon the script beneath his hands. It was an account of the visions of Mandos, the doomsman of the Valar, who had spoken long ago of a sorrow yet to come. "The past is a river," Istani murmured, "and in its currents we sometimes glimpse the shadows of what is yet to be." She closed the book gently, her fingers brushing the worn cover. "But tell me, what do you see in these dreams of yours?" Eärendilion hesitated, then spoke of the withering trees, of the voices that murmured in the dark, of the unseen shadow that stretched its fingers toward the light of Valinor. Istani's face grew grave. "You are not alone in such dreams," she said at last. There are whispers, even among the wise, that the shadow of Morgoth lingers still, though he has long been cast into the void. His malice does not sleep. Erendilion's breath caught. But Valinor is guarded, he said, as if speaking the words would make them true. The Valar themselves dwell here. No evil can set foot upon these shores. Istani did not answer at once. She turned toward the great windows that opened to the west, where the light of the trees shone in undying splendor. Beyond them, the sea stretched into eternity, its waves lapping gently against the white shores of Arman. There is no fortress so strong that it cannot fall, she said at last, not even the blessed realm. Her words settled into his heart like a stone dropped into a still pool. For the first time he felt the stirrings of unease where once there had only been wonder. Far beyond Tirion, in the halls of Formenos, where Feanor, the mightiest of the Noldor, had taken refuge in exile, another fire burned. His was not the quiet light of knowledge, but the fierce and unyielding flame of creation. His hands had wrought the Silmarils, the 3 sacred gems that held within them the light of the 2 trees, captured and made imperishable. And though they were his crowning glory, they were also his greatest torment, for he kept them ever close, fearing that even among his own kin there were those who coveted them. The Valar had summoned him once, seeking to counsel wisdom and peace, but Feanor would not yield. He had seen treachery where there was none, had believed himself betrayed when no hand had moved against him. And so he had withdrawn from Tirion, taking with him those who still followed his will, sealing himself in Formenos with his father, King Finwë, and his beloved Silmarils. But there were whispers in the dark corners of the world, carried by winds that did not belong to the free heirs of Valinor. And one shadow, long exiled yet never truly gone, had listened. Morgoth, he had wandered, long and silent, a wolf prowling outside the golden gates of paradise. His strength was not as it had been, but his cunning was undimmed, and he knew that even in Valinor, where no sword had ever been drawn in war, there was one weapon greater than any blade: pride. The hour of his vengeance was drawing near. On the edge of the world, in the cold wastes where no light reached, he made his way southward. The iron crown upon his brow was empty, its once glorious jewels stolen from him in his fall. But he would have them again, and more, for even the greatest light can cast a shadow. And in Valinor that shadow was growing. The stars shimmered above the white towers of Tirion, casting their silent blessings upon the city of the Noldor. Yet beneath that celestial peace the first fractures of discord had begun to spread. There was unease in the hearts of the Eldar, though they could not yet name it. Some called it restlessness, others ambition, but among the wisest there was a quiet dread, an understanding that the harmony of Valinor had begun to unravel. Erendilyon, still troubled by his dreams, wandered the great halls of knowledge, his thoughts heavy with doubt. The words of Istani haunted him. There is no fortress so strong that it cannot fall. He turned over the pages of history, searching the past for answers to the present. Yet the scrolls spoke only of victories long won, of Morgoth cast into the void, of the light of the trees unbroken, of a world made whole. But history had not foreseen this shadow. Far to the north, beyond the golden plains of Valinor, the exiled prince of the Noldor, Feanor, stood beneath the darkened vaults of Forminus. He ran his fingers over the hard surface of a locked chest, within which lay the three most precious things ever wrought by elven hands, the Silmarils. He had poured his very soul into those gems, binding within them the light of the two trees, a fire that would never fade. But, though they gleamed with untainted beauty, Feanor saw them not with pride, but with fear. He feared the grasping hands of the Valar. He feared the envy of his kin. And most of all, he feared that the Silmarils might one day be taken from him. His sons, 7 strong and bold, watched him with reverence, their hearts bound to his by blood and oath. Medhros, the eldest and wisest, stood nearest, his keen eyes filled with concern. "My father," he said carefully, "your heart is troubled." Feanor turned sharply, his dark hair falling over his shoulders. "Do you not hear them, my son?" he whispered. Feanor's gaze drifted beyond the walls, beyond the world of light and peace. "The whispers," he murmured, "they crawl at the edges of my thoughts like a fire that will not be quenched." His hand clenched over his heart. "They would take them from me." Medhros did not speak at once. He had learned that there were times when Feanor could not be moved from his course. When his mind was a storm, no words could calm. And yet, he did not know whom his father feared. "They are safe, my father," Medhros said, though he felt the weight of the lie upon his tongue. For no light, however great, could be safe from the hunger of the dark. And Morgoth was near, the fall of the trees. The hour of doom was at hand. For long years, Morgoth had wandered the lands beyond Valinor, hiding his strength, nursing his hatred. He had watched and waited, and now he struck. He came not alone. At his side slithered a darkness unlike any that had ever been known before, the monstrous spirit of hunger. Ungoliant, the great spider of the void. She was older than even the first light, a shadow that devoured all it touched. She had no love for Morgoth, nor he for her, but they were bound by need, a hunger, she whispered, her voice rustling like dry leaves, like the scrape of legs upon stone. "And I shall feed you," Morgoth answered. "But first you must drink the light of the world." And so they came, unseen, to the sacred hill of Ezelar, where the two trees stood in their glory, bathed in twilight, for their lights mingled in that moment. Morgoth raised his black spear, and with a cry that shattered the silence of Valinor, he struck. Lochelin, the golden tree, shuddered, and its light flared in agony. A golden rain of sap fell from its wounded trunk, and the ground trembled beneath its fading strength. But worse was still to come. Ungoliant reared upon her many legs, her vast form blotting out the sky, and she drank of the wound. She drank, and she drank, and she drank. The golden light shrank, dimming into nothing, until Laurelin stood as a withered husk, its great branches curling like the fingers of the dying. Then Morgoth turned to Telperion. The silver tree shone with its last defiance, its leaves trembling as though in mourning for its fallen twin, but the darkness was merciless. A second blow fell. The silver leaves withered, their glow fading as Telperion groaned, its song lost to silence. And once more Ungoliant drank. Darkness poured from her, an all-consuming void, swallowing the light of Valinor. The sky, once adorned with the gleam of the trees, fell into an eternal night, and for the first time since the world was made, the blessed realm knew fear. The cry of the Valar echoed across the land. The bells of Valmar rang in despair, and in Tirion the elves looked to the heavens and wept, for the light of their home had been stolen. But in the halls of Forminos, where Feanor stood watch over his Silmarils, the light still burned, for the fire of the trees lived on, held within the gems of the Noldor's greatest craftsman. And Morgoth knew it. The Dark One fled north, his form swallowed in the shadow of Ungoliant, who had grown so vast in her feast that even he feared her. But his plan was not yet complete. The Silmarils, the last remnants of light, still lay within reach. And so, as Valinor reeled in its grief, as the Valar gathered beneath the lifeless branches of the trees, Morgoth came once more to Forminos. He came as a storm in the night, a darkness that no star could pierce. And he was met by Finwë, High King of the Noldor, father of Feanor, who alone stood before the gates of his stronghold. "Stand aside," Morgoth commanded, his voice a chasm that swallowed all warmth. But Finwë did not yield. "You shall not enter here, black foe of the world," he declared, "not while there is breath in my body." And so Morgoth slew him, the first murderer in Valinor's long history. Finwë, the first elf to be born upon these shores, the first to see the light of the trees, fell before the might of the great enemy. With his death, the gates were torn asunder, the Silmarils were taken, and Feanor, far away, felt the wound in his heart as though his very soul had been cloven in two. He knew, and he screamed his wrath to the heavens, a cry that rang across the darkened land. And in that moment, the fate of the Noldor was sealed. The time of peace was over. The time of war had begun. A silence unlike any before, it settled over Valinor. It was a silence vast and suffocating, pressing against the hills and the white towers, curling through the golden streets of Tirion, heavy as the weight of the sea before a storm. The light of the trees was gone, devoured, leaving only the black void of an empty sky. In that dreadful moment, the world itself seemed to pause, caught in the first breath of sorrow. Even the wind hesitated, as if unwilling to carry the sound of weeping. And in the great halls of the Valar, beneath the vaulted domes of gold and pearl, The mighty ones of the world stood in grief, their faces pale with shock. It was Nienna, Lady of Mourning, who moved first. Silent as the mist upon still waters, she descended the long stairs of the halls, her grey raiment flowing like rain upon the earth. At the roots of the trees where the darkness lay thick as ink, she knelt upon the trembling ground. Her slender hands brushed against the lifeless bark, and a soft sound, half sigh, half song, escaped her lips. It was a lament too deep for words, a sorrow older than the making of the stars. And as her tears fell upon the withered roots, the air stirred, as if the trees themselves, in the very last of their dreaming, wept with her. Behind her, the voice of Manwë, High King of the Valar, rose like a wind upon the mountains. But his words, though noble and filled with power, faltered beneath the weight of loss. "It is done," he murmured, his gaze lost in the void where light had once dwelled. "The dark hand has struck, and even our might could not foresee nor prevent this hour." Varda, Queen of the Stars, stood beside him, her face carved in sorrow like marble untouched by time. "It is not done," she said, her voice a whisper of distant starlight, "for even the blackest night must yield to dawn." But dawn, if it would come, was far beyond the reach of that moment. In Tirion, beneath the shadow of night, the Noldor stood restless. For them, grief was not a quiet thing. It was fire and anguish, rage and the roar of a sea in tempest. And at their head, like a flame burning against the black sky, stood Feanor. He had seen the darkness from afar, had felt the breaking of the trees as if they had been struck not by Morgoth's spear, but by the unrelenting hand of doom itself. And then came the greater wound, the Silmarils. Stone. The thought was a brand of ice pressed into his chest, a wound deeper than the breaking of the world itself. He clutched at his throat, as if struggling for breath, his whole body trembling with fury. "Blackest of foes," he rasped, his voice raw as an ember caught in the wind. "Thief and betrayer. He has taken them from me, the jewels of my soul, the light of my labor, the heart of my house. I swear by the blood in my veins, by the fire that still burns within me, I shall not rest until they are wrested from his grasp." His sons, tall and proud, surrounded him, their faces mirrors of his own torment. It was Maedhros, ever the voice of caution, who stepped forward first. "My father," he said, his voice steady, though sorrow lay beneath it, "the light of the Silmarils yet lives, even if in the black grasp of the enemy. But we stand here, unarmed and unready. Let us go to the Valar. Let us seek justice from them who have guided us since the world began." Feanor turned upon him, his eyes like two burning stars. "Justice?" he spat. "You ask me to seek justice from those who have long sought to bind us, to hold us back with honeyed words and silken chains? Where was their justice when Morgoth walked free, whispering poison into the ears of our kin? Where was their might when he struck, when the trees fell, when my father—" His voice broke. He closed his eyes, shaking with a pain too great for words, for he had felt it, felt the death of Finwë as surely as if the sword had pierced his own heart. "My father," he whispered, his hands curling into fists. Slain, slain in his own halls, while the Valar mourned their trees. A night wind howled through the white streets of Tirion. It lifted the banners of the high towers and made the fountains shiver in the darkness. But the city was still. Every Noldor that stood in the square listened. Their faces turned to Feanor as though his voice alone could command the world to move again. And he spoke. "They will not avenge us," he said, his voice thick with scorn. "They will bid us wait, to weep, to bow our heads in silence while the enemy grows in power. No, I will not kneel, I will not beg. My hands are my own, my fate is my own. If the Valar will not go to war, then we shall." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Maedhros took a step back, his lips parted, his eyes shadowed. "You mean to leave?" he said softly, though he had already seen the answer in his father's face. Feanor lifted his chin. "We go to Middle-earth," he declared, and the words rang like a hammer striking the first blow of war. "We go to reclaim that which is ours, to hunt the enemy to the ends of the world. No longer shall we be prisoners of the will of others. We are the Noldor. We are the mightiest of the Eldar, and we will carve our fate with our own hands." A great roar rose from the gathered elves, the sound of steel unsheathing, of hearts igniting. But amid them some stood silent, their eyes troubled. Among them was Fingolfin. He, too, was of the house of Finwë. He, too, had felt the loss. But he had always seen what Feanor did not, that the path of fire led only to ruin, and in his heart a terrible premonition took root. For the wind that passed through Tirion that night was cold, and though the stars shone above, they seemed distant, veiled, as if watching from a world apart. A shadow had fallen over the Noldor, and though they did not know it, they had already set foot upon a road that would lead them into darkness. The wind stirred the golden dust of Tirion, carrying with it the scent of the sea and the silent echoes of a paradise that had been shattered. It moved through the high colonnades of the city, whispering through the white archways and ivy-clad balustrades, as if trying to fill the space left by the absence of the trees' radiance. But there was no comfort in that breeze now. It was restless, anxious, a harbinger of something unseen, yet deeply felt. The Noldor had gathered in the great square before the tower of Mindon Elderlever, their faces upturned toward the lone figure that stood upon the marble steps. Feanor, son of Finwë, his cloak dark as the void where the stars had yet to return. His voice had already set the blood of his people ablaze, yet he stood silent now, his hand resting upon the pommel of his sword. His eyes, fierce and smouldering, swept over the gathered host, seeing not just his kin, but a people standing at the precipice of fate. Then he spoke, and his words were like the forging of steel. "Our people, my kin, my brothers," he began, his voice low, though it carried over the vastness of the crowd like the first whisper of a storm upon a quiet lake. Long have we dwelt in Valinor, beneath the light of the trees, beneath the watchful gaze of the Valar, whom we have called our lords. We have been given wisdom, we have been given peace, and we have been given love. He paused, and for a moment the world itself seemed to hold its breath. But what is peace, if it is but the peace of a cage? What is love, if it chains the heart and binds the will? What is wisdom, if it is given only to those who will never know the fire of choice? The murmurs rippled through the Noldor, uncertain, yet entranced. Long have I pondered, Feanor continued, and now his voice grew richer, like a river swelling after the first rains of spring. Long have I questioned, why were we brought here, to this land of light? Were we meant only to be cherished, to be held as beautiful things in a garden walled away from the world? Were we not meant to walk free beneath the stars, as we once did, in the time before the Valar summoned us here? He spread his arms, his cloak billowing with the wind. Yet see what has come to pass. The great enemy whom the Valar swore to keep in chains has returned to power. He walks free, unchallenged, while we, the greatest of the Eldar, stood idle in our halls, believing ourselves safe, believing ourselves wise, believing that the hands of the Valar would keep us from harm. See now what that folly has wrought. His voice rose, and it struck like a hammer against an anvil. The trees are gone, the light of our world is devoured, and worse, here his voice trembled with fury, worse than even this, Morgoth, the great deceiver, has taken from me my Silmarils, the fire of my soul, the work of my hands, the jewels that alone hold the last light of what has been stolen from us. His hand clenched into a fist, shaking. And my father, the noble Finwë, who first led us into this land, he is slain in his own halls, and no sword was raised in time to stop it. Tell me, my kin, where now is the justice of the Valar? Where now is the power of those whom we have obeyed in all things? If they cannot defend their own realm, why should we place our trust in them? A silence heavier than stone fell upon the Noldor. No one spoke. No one breathed. Feanor's voice dropped to a whisper, but it carried like thunder. They will tell us to wait. They will tell us to grieve. They will tell us to let go, to remain, to remain, to remain. He turned, his eyes blazing with something terrible. But I will not. I will not remain in a land where I am caged by fate. I will not remain in a land where my father's blood lies unavenged, where my Silmarils lie in a thief's hands. I will go to Middle-earth. I will cross the dark waters. I will hunt Morgoth to the ends of the world, and I will reclaim what is mine, what is ours, and I will rend the very heavens before I am denied my vengeance. He lifted his sword, and it gleamed with the pale reflection of unseen stars. Who will follow me? For a moment all was still. Then, from the front of the crowd, a voice rang out. I will. Maedhros, the eldest of Feanor's sons, stepped forward, his crimson hair catching the ghostly glow of the city's lamps. He looked into his father's eyes, searching for something. Assurance, perhaps, or certainty, but there was only fire. I will follow you, Maedhros said again, more softly this time. Not because I thirst for war, nor for vengeance alone, but because I have seen what you have seen. The light is gone, Father. We cannot live in this twilight. We were not made to sit in silence while the world moves without us. Then came Maglor, his voice, once a thing of music, now filled with sorrow. I will go. Then Selagorm, Caranthir, Curufin. Then Amrod and Amrus, the youngest, their hearts bound as one. And then, like the breaking of a great wave, the Noldor cried out as one, their voices rising into the empty night. We will go. Fingolfin stood among them, silent. He had not yet spoken, nor had his sons, nor had his people, yet already he saw what was happening. A tide had begun to rise, one that could not be turned aside by any wisdom, by any plea. He looked at his brother, and he knew Fëanor had already won. Beside him, Turgon, his son, spoke at last. Father, he murmured, if we leave Valinor, we may never return. Fingolfin turned his gaze to the dark horizon, where once the two trees had stood. Their light was gone, and he knew in the quiet spaces of his heart that his son's words were true. The road ahead would be long, and it would be steeped in blood. But the choice had already been made. The sky above Tirion had lost its radiance. No longer did it mirror the mingling lights of Telperion and Lorelin, those sacred beacons whose glow had once spilled across the world in silver and gold. Now the heavens stood empty, vast, black, an abyss into which the hearts of the Noldor fell, echoing with grief. Yet even in the depths of sorrow, fire had been kindled. The flames of wrath and longing, of defiance and resolve, burned bright in the souls of the elves gathered before the high steps of the Mindon Elveleliva. Their eyes, gleaming like embers in the twilight, were fixed upon the figure who stood above them, sword raised, a vision of flame against the night. Fëanor. His name was already legend, but now it would become something more. Not merely the greatest craftsman of the Noldor, not merely the father of the Silmarils, but something greater, something more terrible, a leader of exiles, a storm upon the horizon, a force that no will could break. Beneath him, the Noldor murmured amongst themselves, their voices low, uncertain, like the first rumblings of thunder before a great tempest. Some were carried by his fire, ready to cast themselves into the darkness beyond the seas. But others hesitated, shadows flickering in their minds, the weight of doom pressing against their hearts. It was Fingolfin who finally broke the silence. He stepped forward, slow and measured, each movement deliberate as though he waded through unseen tides. His silver hair, unbound, caught what little light remained in the darkened city, and his blue mantle, once rich as the summer sky, now seemed as faded as the evening before an unending storm. He faced his brother. "Fëanor," he said, and his voice, though calm, bore the weight of mountains. "You speak of vengeance, of reclaiming what has been taken, of forging a path not bound by the will of the Valar. You cry out that we must go to Middle-earth and take our fate into our own hands. But tell me this, what fate do you see? What road do you call upon our people to walk?" Fëanor's fiery gaze met Fingolfin's cool, piercing eyes, and for a moment there was only silence between them. "What road?" Fëanor's voice was quiet, but there was steel beneath it. "Do you not know, my brother? Have you not felt the chains placed upon us, even here in this land of light? I have walked beneath these golden halls. I have looked upon the serene faces of the Valar, and I have seen in their eyes what they dare not speak. We were not brought here as kings, nor as lords, nor even as allies. We were brought here as children, beautiful children, yes, to be adorned and loved, but children all the same." He turned, his gaze sweeping over the gathered Noldor. "How long have we lived in the bliss of a man? How long have we drunk the honeyed words of the Valar, telling us that we are safe, that we are protected, that we should be content? But tell me, my people, are we content? Is this our fate? To sit beneath their halls and wait for the turning of the world, to live in peace while the enemy still walks free?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some nodded, others shifted uncomfortably. Fëanor took a step forward, descending a single step closer to the gathered host. "The Valar say that we are free, and yet when we sought to create, they questioned our will. When we sought to build, they asked us to be patient. When I with my own hands wrought the Silmarils, did they rejoice? No, they coveted them. They bid me bring them forth, that they might keep them, might lock them away in their own halls, away even from my sight." His voice rose, ringing out like a blade drawn from its sheath. "And where were they when Morgoth came? Where was their power when the trees withered? Where was their justice when my father was slain?" The wind stirred, cold now, rushing through the streets of Tirion like a whisper of things to come. The high lamps that lined the great square flickered in their silver sconces, their flames bending and twisting like trembling souls caught between choices. Fingolfin stood motionless, but his heart was not still. "You say that we have been caged," he replied at last, his voice softer but no less powerful. "That we have been led like children, given gifts in place of freedom. That we have been denied our true fate. Perhaps there is truth in your words, brother. But have you also weighed the cost of this road you set before us?" Fëanor did not move, but his silence invited Fingolfin to continue. "You speak of the Valar's failure to guard their realm. You say that they were blind, that they did not see the darkness that grew within it. But you, did you see it? You speak of Morgoth's theft, but did you not listen to his whispers? Did you not grant him the very knowledge he needed to strike at our hearts?" A flicker of something passed across Fëanor's face, but it was gone in an instant, buried beneath the fire of his pride. "You speak of vengeance," Fingolfin pressed on, stepping closer, "of reclaiming what is yours. But tell me, what will you leave behind? You say we are caged, but are we? If we leave, will we not be bound to something far greater? To an oath of war, to a road of exile, to a fate that may not be as free as you believe?" Fëanor clenched his jaw. A gilded cage is still a cage, and a war unending is still a chain, Fingolfin countered. "Once we step upon this path, there will be no return. You know this as well as I." For a long moment neither spoke. The wind howled through the arches of the city. A banner bearing the star of the house of Finwë shuddered on its pole, as if caught in the breath of fate itself. Then Fëanor smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "No return," he repeated softly. "And what of it? Better to march into darkness by our own will than to linger in twilight by another's decree." He turned away from Fingolfin, once more facing the Noldor. "I do not command you," he declared. "I do not hold your hearts in my hand as the Valar would wish to do. I do not force you to follow me. But if you feel the fire within you, if you will not abide this fate of stillness and sorrow, if you would carve your own road through the darkness, then come. Come with me across the seas. Come with me to reclaim what is ours." There was a long silence, and then one voice, then another. A murmur, then a cry, then a roar. "We will go." The hosts of the Noldor raised their hands, their voices shaking the very walls of Tirion. The sound of it carried into the night, a great tide rising, unstoppable. Fingolfin stood among them, unmoving. He looked upon his brother, and he knew. The march had begun. The world would never be the same again. The night in Valinor had become vast, stretching beyond the edges of sight, an endless abyss where once light had ruled. A deep hush lay upon the city of Tirion, as though the very stones held their breath, waiting. The high spires, once gleaming under the mingling lights of Telperion and Lorelin, now stood in the darkness like mournful sentinels, watching over a world that had changed in the span of a single night. And in the great square, beneath the white tower of Minden Eldeleava, the Noldor stood, bound not by walls nor by chains, but by the force of a will greater than any decree of the Valar. Fëanor had ignited a fire within them. Yet fire was a hungry thing. It did not pause to consider what it consumed. Fingolfin remained at the edges of the host, his mind a storm, his breath slow and deliberate as he tried to weigh the words that had been spoken, the choices that had been laid before him. His brother's voice still rang in his ears, resonant, commanding, sharp as a blade honed upon a whetstone. The people had answered. The tide had turned. But tides did not only rise, they also drowned. He turned his gaze to the high walls that encircled Tirion, to the great gates that led out onto the long roads that wound through the Cala Syria, the narrow pass between the mountains. Beyond those gates lay the sea, vast and unknown, where no ship had yet ventured without the blessing of the Valar. He drew a long breath, heavy with thought, before finally stepping forward. The murmuring crowd quieted as he approached the stairs where Fëanor still stood, his presence like a beacon in the dark. His sword gleamed in the flickering torchlight, and his eyes were alight with something fierce, something that had lived in him long before Morgoth's treachery, long before the first stone of Tirion had been laid. "Brother," Fingolfin said at last, his voice cutting through the hush like the first breath of wind before a coming storm. "You have spoken with fire, And the people have answered, "But I would have you speak once more, not as one who commands, but as one who would lead. We stand upon the threshold of exile, and there are many who follow you out of love, not only out of wrath. If they are to go, let them go with open eyes. Tell them, Fenaro, what world do you lead them into? What end do you seek?" Feanor tilted his head slightly, as though considering the weight of the words. He stepped forward, slowly descending the white marble steps until he stood level with Fingolfin. When he spoke, it was not with the shouting fire of before, but with a voice measured and steady, as if shaping each word with care. "You ask me what world I lead them into," he said. "Tell me first, brother, what world remains to us here?" He turned, gesturing toward the high halls and towers of Tirion, to the polished streets where their people had walked for centuries in peace. But the peace had been shattered. The light that had once shone upon those stones, now lost. "Look upon it," he continued. "This is a city built for joy, for song, for light. But tell me, Fingolfin, what light remains? The two trees are slain, and with them the very heart of this land has withered. The Valar, whom we once trusted, have shown us their wisdom. They who knew the enemy was among us, they who knew of his whispers, of his poison, yet they did nothing, and now they mourn, slow and still, while the Dark One flees with the Silmarils in his grasp. You ask me what world I would lead our people into? I ask you, what world is left here?" Fingolfin did not answer at once. His heart ached with the weight of truth. "Perhaps there is no world left here," he admitted. "Do you know what lies beyond? You say we were brought to this land as children, that we have been bound by the will of others, that we have not known true freedom, and yet, for all your wisdom, for all your fire, you do not know what awaits us in Middle-earth. It is not the land of our birth. It is not the land that was made for us. The Valar did not summon us here to torment us, Feanor. They summoned us because the world we left behind was filled with darkness, with war, with blood. Do you think it has changed?" Feanor's gaze darkened. "Perhaps not, but I would rather walk through darkness by my own will than linger in the twilight under another's." Fingolfin exhaled slowly. "And is vengeance your only guide?" Feanor stepped closer, his voice a whisper now, meant only for his brother's ears. "No," he said. "Vengeance is the spark, but the fire is more than that. You do not see it yet, but I know you feel it. The world is changing. This is not only about Morgoth. This is about us, about what we are meant to be. We are not meant to linger here, bound by the pity of gods who see us as beautiful but fragile things. I will not be fragile. I will not be bound, and I will not be still." The wind rose again, stirring the banners that hung from the high towers. The sigil of Finwë, their father, rippled against the night, its golden star gleaming against the dark cloth. Fingolfin looked upon it, upon the symbol of their house, and he saw in it the weight of everything that had come before. Of the great journey from Kivienen, of the first light of the trees, of the days when their father had walked in wisdom, not in wrath. And now Finwë was gone, and his son stood at the edge of exile. He turned back to Feanor. "Then I will not hinder you," he said at last. "If this is your will, then so be it. But I will not follow blindly. If I go with my people, not as one who chases your shadow, but as one who will guide them when the fire burns too hot." Feanor did not smile, but something in his eyes flickered. Acknowledgement, perhaps, or something close to it. "Then let it be so," he murmured. The night deepened. The Noldor murmured amongst themselves, caught between the light of the past and the shadow of what lay ahead. The march had begun, and nothing would stop it now. The night hung over Tirion like a great and endless shadow. The stars, once reflected in the silver streets, now seemed distant, as if reluctant to shine upon a land where light had been betrayed. The high towers, crowned with gilded domes, stood as monuments to a past that had fractured in the space of a single night. And the wind, it moved like a ghost between the marble colonnades, cold and searching, whispering against the banners that bore the sigil of Finwë, as though mourning the king who would walk those halls no more. Beneath that sorrowful sky, the Noldor prepared to depart. The streets, once filled with song and laughter, were now filled with hushed voices and the sound of hurried steps. Cloaks billowed in the dark, the glint of polished mail flashed beneath the flickering torchlight, and silver helms caught the glow of lanterns swaying in the wind. Families gathered what little they could carry, blades forged by elven smiths, heirlooms from the days before a man, relics of a time now lost. At the gates of the city, Fingolfin stood, watching as the host assembled, a quiet tempest within his heart. He had spoken his peace to Feanor, and yet still his thoughts waged war. Was this truly the path they should take? Did the fire in their spirits blind them to what lay ahead? The sea loomed beyond the Calaseria, its vastness unfathomable in the darkness. It was said that no ship had crossed its depths without the guidance of the Valar, that the lands beyond were shrouded in peril, unknown and untamed. He had walked the shores in his youth, had gazed upon the horizon and wondered what lay beyond, but never had he thought that he would stand here now, with the weight of exile pressing upon his shoulders, pressing on his shoulders. A voice pulled him from his thoughts. "You hesitate." It was Torgon, his son. The torchlight played upon his face, casting deep shadows beneath his furrowed brow, illuminating the quiet concern in his grey eyes. He was clad in a silver breastplate, his dark hair bound behind him, a helm cradled in his arm. He looked every inch a prince of the Noldor, and yet in his eyes there was something uncertain, something restless. Fingolfin turned to him, exhaling slowly. "Should I not?" he murmured. "Should we not all hesitate, if only for a moment?" Turgon stepped closer, his voice softer now. "If we hesitate, will it change what has already begun?" Fingolfin did not answer at once. He turned his gaze back to the sea, to the high cliffs that overlooked the vast expanse of black water. "No," he admitted at last. "It will not." Turgon studied him for a long moment before speaking again, more cautiously. "I have tried to see the future," he said quietly. "I have turned it over in my thoughts as one turns a gem beneath the light, and no matter which way I look upon it, I cannot see the end of this road." Fingolfin's gaze did not leave the horizon. "That is because the end is not yet written," he said. Turgon was silent for a moment, then he spoke again, slower now, more measured. "I have always believed that the Valar brought us here for a reason, that they did not summon our people from the dark wilds of Middle-earth only to abandon us now, and yet—" he paused, his fingers tightening upon the hilt of his sword. "And yet, if that reason was to protect us, why do I feel as though we have been left to stand alone?" The words hung between them, heavy as stone. Fingolfin turned at last, looking upon his son. "It is not an easy thing to question the will of those who shape the world," he said. "We have looked to them as guides, as guardians, as those who know the course of all things. But tell me, Torgon, do you think even they know all that is to come?" Turgon did not answer. Fingolfin sighed, his breath a mist in the chill night air. "The Valar are mighty, but they are not beyond error. They were not beyond error when Morgoth walked among them, when he sowed his lies among us, when he took the light of the trees, when he took my father's life. And now they would have us remain here, waiting, mourning, doing nothing. But I am not made for stillness. I am not made to be an ornament in a fading court." He turned once more to the sea, his expression unreadable. "We go forward because there is no road left behind us." Turgon was silent, then bowed his head. "Then we go." Behind them the host of the Noldor gathered in the square, a restless tide of silver and blue, of cloaks lined with starlight, of helms gleaming in the pale torchlight. Their voices rose in murmurs, in farewells, in quiet resolutions. And upon the high steps of the city, Feanor stood once more. He gazed down upon his people, upon the thousands who had answered his call, and in his eyes there was no doubt. His voice, when he spoke, was clear as struck steel. We marched, and so the gates of Tirion were thrown open, and for the first time in an age, the Noldor left the city that had been their home, the city that had stood beneath the light of the trees, the city that would stand empty in their absence. The roads of exile lay before them, and the night was deep. The exodus had begun. The gates of Tirion, so long untouched by war, so long unbarred save for the passage of joy and celebration, now stood open to the night. A great host passed beneath its high arches, their footsteps falling in solemn rhythm upon the marble roads, echoing through the stillness like the beat of an ancient drum. The lamps that lined the streets flickered, casting elongated shadows against the pale stone walls. Shadows that stretched, wavered, and twisted like omens upon the quiet halls they left behind. And as the Noldor marched forward, the city behind them faded into silence. Fingolfin walked at the head of his people, his expression unreadable, his heart a storm. To either side of him his captains moved like silent sentinels, their faces grim beneath the gleam of their helms. Torgon rode beside him, his dark hair unbound, his gaze turned eastward, toward the Calaseria, the great pass that would lead them out of the lands of the Valar. For a long time neither spoke. It was Turgon who finally broke the silence. His voice hushed, as though he feared to wake some unseen thing in the depths of the night. "It feels as though the city itself watches us," he murmured, "as though it knows we are leaving it behind." Fingolfin did not turn his head, but he felt the truth in those words. The weight of ages lay upon Tirion, upon its walls, upon its high towers crowned with gold. This had been their home since the days of awakening beneath the light of the trees. Now its streets would stand empty, and the white halls would echo with silence. "We do not leave Tirion behind," Fingolfin said at last. "We carry it with us, even now. In the hearts of all who march, the city still stands." Turgon considered that for a moment, his brows furrowing. "But will it remain unchanged? Or will it become only a dream, a thing of memory? If ever we return, will we find it as we left it? Or will it be as all dreams are, less than we remembered, and less than it once was?" Fingolfin exhaled slowly. "The past does not remain as it was, neither do we. But though we may never walk these streets again, we are still the Noldor. That which we have built in stone we can rebuild in another land. That which we have wrought in song we shall sing again." Turgon's gaze darkened, "And yet we do not march to build, we march to war." A silence stretched between them, the weight of truth heavy upon the air. At last Fingolfin turned his head, his silver hair catching the faint gleam of starlight. "Would you have us remain?" Turgon did not answer immediately. His hands tightened upon the reins of his steed, his expression shadowed. "No," he admitted, "for what remains for us here save mourning?" He looked eastward again, his voice low. "But I do not wish to trade mourning for ruin." Fingolfin sighed, and for the first time his voice carried a weariness that he could not hide. "Neither do I." They fell into silence once more, and the host of the Noldor pressed onward. Ahead the Calaseria loomed before them, a great pass carved between the high walls of the Pelori, the encircling mountains of Aman. Beyond it lay the sea, dark and restless beneath the moon's cold gaze. Beyond that, Middle-earth, where fate had begun to weave its threads, where war and shadow waited to greet them. But before they could pass through that gate, a figure stood before them, barring the way. A lone figure, robed in grey, his staff planted upon the ground like the root of some ancient and unmoving tree. Mandos, the doomsmen of the Valar. His presence was like the hush before a great storm, the stillness of air when the sky darkens and the wind holds its breath. He did not move, he did not speak, yet his eyes, deep and fathomless as the void beyond the stars, beheld them, and all who walked before him felt the weight of his gaze. Feanor, who had ridden ahead, reined his horse sharply, his lips curling as he beheld the one who had come to speak doom. You come too late, doomsman, he said, his voice like the edge of a sword. We have made our choice. Mandos did not move, but his voice came forth, deep as the chasms beneath the world. The choice is yours to make, he said. But hear now the doom of the Noldor. A hush fell upon the host. The torches flickered, the night wind stirred. Mandos lifted his staff, and his voice rang out, cold and inexorable as the turning of the stars. Ye have spilled the blood of your own kin, and by that deed ye have woven your fate. The shadow ye go to seek shall find you first, and treachery shall be your doom. Tears unnumbered shall ye shed, and the world shall remember your sorrow for all time. The Valar shall not aid you in your war, nor shall ye return save in bitter exile. The house of Feanor shall not be a land of triumph, but a land of grief. The house of Feanor shall be divided, and none shall escape the doom that now falls upon them. A great silence followed. Then Feanor laughed, a wild, fierce laugh like fire snapping in the heart of winter. He flung his head back, his dark hair spilling over his shoulders, his eyes bright as embers. Doom, he said. What care I for doom? Let the stars weep, let the mountains shake, let the Valar sit in their halls and speak words of woe. I shall not turn back. If grief awaits us, let it come. If shadow lies upon the road, let it rise to meet us. We do not seek pity, nor shall we ask for it. He turned in his saddle, casting his gaze over the gathered Noldor. Let all who fear this doom turn back now. Let them slink away into silence, into the twilight of this land. But those who would stand with me, those who would carve their fate with their own hands, come. We go to Middle-earth. We go to reclaim what is ours. And the host cried out in answer. Mandos did not move. His expression did not change. He merely lowered his staff, and with a voice as still as the grave, he spoke once more. Howbeit. Then he was gone, vanishing into the night like mist upon the wind. And the Noldor passed through the Calaceria, leaving Valinor behind them. The winds of Amen grew cold as the last of the Noldor passed through the Calaceria, the great pass that led out of Valinor. Behind them, Tirion's white towers stood quiet, the gleaming halls of their people now abandoned, left to be haunted by memories and silence. There was no music to bid them farewell, no voices of the Valar to call them back. The gates that had once stood open in welcome now seemed like the bars of a golden cage, closing forever behind them. The first steps beyond the pass felt heavier than the weight of any armor, heavier than any burden of steel or gold. The land beyond was unfamiliar, untouched, untamed, stretching toward the dark shore where the sea lay restless beneath the void of the sky. There, in the distance, the waters of Belecgalir, the great sea, churned with unseen tempests, their vast expanse dark as jet beneath the cold gleam of the distant stars. Fingolfin turned once before he descended from the mountain pass, looking back upon the realm of the Valar, upon the land where they had lived for so many ages in peace. The sky above Valinor was empty. There were no golden and silver beams of the two trees, only the dim, watchful light of the stars. It seemed to him in that moment that the very air of Aman had changed. as if the land itself knew it had been forsaken. Turgon rode beside him, his face unreadable. The long black hair of the prince stirred in the wind, his silver armor dulled by the night, and his thoughts lay far beyond this moment. "We were not meant to leave this land," he murmured, his voice nearly lost to the sighing wind. Fingolfin said nothing. He knew the words were true, and yet here they stood. Ahead of them, the host of the Noldor moved forward, a river of steel and silver, banners snapping like restless spirits. And at the front of that tide rode Feanor, his head high, his eyes burning, his form wreathed in the fire of his own unyielding will. The sound of marching feet filled the air, but among them were murmurs of uncertainty, hushed voices that wove through the ranks like an unspoken fear. The doom of Mandos lay upon them now, heavy as a shroud of iron. Though no one had turned back, though none had spoken against the path set before them, Fingolfin could feel the weight of doubt pressing upon many shoulders. He felt it in himself. The darkened shores. The land descended toward the coast, and soon the scent of salt filled the air. The cliffs of Aemon loomed high above the sea, great jagged walls of stone that seemed to stand in defiance of all who would leave or return. The waves crashed against the shores far below, a sound ancient and ceaseless, whispering to those who stood upon the edge of the world. Feanor reined in his horse at the summit of the cliffs, standing tall upon the highest point, gazing out across the black waters of the sea. There was no light upon the waves, only the endless expanse of shadow stretching toward the unknown. "We will need ships," Maedhros murmured, coming to stand beside his father. "The way is closed to us without them." Feanor's gaze did not shift. He did not even blink. "Then we shall take them." And at that moment the fate of Alcolond was sealed. The white ships of the Teleri, the swan-prowed vessels of those who had long loved the sea, lay in their harbours beyond these cliffs. The Teleri, the first to hear the music of the waves, the first to sing to the stars beneath the whispering breeze, had built those ships with love and care, with hands that did not craft for war. But war was coming to them now. Fingolfin's breath was slow, deliberate. He had known this moment would come, but he had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that there would be another way. "The Teleri will not give them freely," he said. His voice was calm, but there was something deeper beneath it, something sharp and full of warning. "They will not fight you, not in the way you expect, but they will not yield." Feanor turned his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Then they will be made to yield." A silence stretched between them. The air itself seemed to hush, as if waiting for the words that would be spoken next. Fingolfin felt the ice within him grow heavier. "They are our kin," he said at last. Feanor's eyes burned like dying stars. "They are in our way." The wind stirred, and Fingolfin felt for the first time the true depth of the path they had chosen. It was not merely exile. It was not merely war. This was something else, something far worse. He saw, in that moment, the road that Feanor would walk, the road that they all would walk, and he knew that there would be no turning back. The first kinslaying, the battle for the ships of Alqualonde, was swift and merciless. The Teleri, though unarmed, resisted. They clung to their ships, to the vessels that had carried them across the world, the vessels that had sung beneath their hands, that had whispered to them with the voice of the sea itself. They stood before the swords of the Noldor, before the wrath of their kinsmen, and they did not move aside. And so the first blade was drawn. It did not matter who struck first. The first cry of pain rang out upon the shore, and then the blood followed. The swan ships burned. The white foam of the waves turned red. The stars above did not weep, but the cries of the Teleri filled the night, and the halls of Mandos grew darker still. Fingolfin did not raise his sword, but neither did he turn away. He stood upon the shore as his people waged war against their own kin, as the white ships of the Teleri were torn from their hands, as the sea swallowed the dead. He did not move. He did not speak. He only watched, and something within him broke. The last gaze of Valinor, when the battle was over, when the ships of the Teleri lay smouldering upon the black waters, when the host of the Noldor stood victorious in silence, Feanor raised his head and looked westward. There, upon the high cliffs of Aemon, a single light still burned. A figure stood there, far above them, clad in raiment of grey. No face could be seen, no features discerned, but all who looked upon that figure felt the weight of judgment, the sorrow of a world breaking. It was Manwë, the High King of the Valar, and he did not speak. He only watched as the last of the Noldor set sail into exile. Fingolfin stood upon the deck of one of the stolen ships, the wind lashing against his face, the salt air thick with the scent of fire. He looked toward the land they had left, toward the last light of the blessed realm. He did not know if they would ever return, and he did not know if they deserved to. And so the Noldor sailed into shadow, leaving the light behind them, and the world would never be the same again.